I mean, just something as simple as if Tinder had a slider on how often you want to have sex. You're constantly just turned on as a teenager, and it's not that I needed to hear specific things. I just needed to have a safe space to have that conversation.
Talk about sex. Okay, we're talking about sex now. So, Phil, I wanted to start every episode by just going into growing up in your household. What were the conversations, or what were the not conversations that were happening around sex?
Sure. I mean, I grew up in quite a conservative Christian home in the UK, and generally speaking, sex was not on the table. I can honestly say I cannot remember seeing my mum or dad kiss. Period. Like, not a when I was growing up, not a, in the last year. Like, no, period. I cannot recall seeing my mum or dad ever kiss. Don't remember see them hugging, kind of like playing around, any of that. So like, it just wasn't on the table. There just wasn't a conversation around this. It didn't happen. I sure they had a great sex life. In fact, talking to my dad or my mum in more recent years, I know they did. It's great. But that just wasn't on the table as far as an option to talk about growing up. We didn't talk about sex. It was this kind of unspoken thing. And generally speaking, there wasn't even even having like the talk. That's not really on the table either. That was a thing that was kind of like given over to like the church youth group would always have like a lot of focus on sex and purity and these kind of concepts that were very common in kind of conservative Christian backgrounds. And so it was kind of almost given to the church to educate your children on sex. And so we really didn't talk about sex. I had one talk with my dad about sex my entire life. I think I was 15 and I was going out the back door. I was going to go to play with some friends, go around to their house. And 15 years old, I don't know what I was going to do, go play football in the streets or play video games at someone's house, something like that, And so I'm leaving the house and my dad, he's making a meal in the kitchen. He stops and he goes, "Hey, Phil." And I'm like, "Yeah." And he's like, "You know what sex is, right?" And I'm like, 15-year-old boy. Now, in all fairness, I was a 15-year-old boy that was very introverted, very shy, very underdeveloped, had barely started puberty at this point. Like, I was not your like usual 15-year-old boy. But still, I thought it was a pretty harsh question. He's like, "So you know what sex is?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Okay." He's like, "And you know to use a condom?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Okay, do you want to talk any more about this?" And I was like, "No." He's like, "Okay." And I just left the house. And that was it. That was the entire extent of the conversation of sex with my father. That I just didn't have any kind of input on what is sex, what is sexuality, what is a healthy orientation towards sex, what should our sexual ethics be, any of these kind of things. And so, yeah, I didn't have that from my family upbringing.
Yeah, I mean, totally. I can relate to a lot of that, and I just have to say this because you keep saying the phrase "sex wasn't on the table," and I just keep having this image of having sex on a table. Okay,
We've all done
yeah, we've all been there, right? Anyways, I want to go back to so you said you never had like a healthy conversation about sex growing up.
it.
So what was your relationship as a teenage boy with sex growing up? Like, what were your
Yeah.
thoughts and your emotions and your like, your dad was like, "Oh, do you want to talk about it?" And you're like, no way, dad. So what were the
Right.
thoughts
Yeah. Yeah.
behind
Yeah.
that?
There was like I was seriously messed up with my orientation towards sex, towards my own sexual drives. Any of that stuff was really, really messed up because my parents were so shut down about this area of life, and because the church was so vocal about how wrong sex was before marriage, which was the position of most conservative churches you'll find in Christianity will have that position. You can't have sex before marriage. You can't do much before marriage, but we don't talk about that because that's even more taboo to kind of go into details. But all that was kind of talked about within the church was just like sex is evil and sex is wrong unless you're married. And then suddenly, as soon as the second you get married, like it's perfect and it's the best thing in the world. And so that's a psychological twist for a lot of people to go through anyway. But growing up as a teenager, that doesn't change the fact that you hit puberty and hormones are like, "Hey, hi, I'm here. You have an erection." I know it's been 3 seconds since your last erection, but I'm back. You know, like that was just being a teenager, right? I mean, any teenage boy will empathize with the fact that your body is going, hi, I am really excited, and it's because I looked at a water bottle, or because I was crossing the street and that car made me think of a boob. I mean, literally, it doesn't matter. Like, you're constantly just turned on as a teenager, and yet all the signals you're getting, your parents aren't talking about sex. They're kind of like hushing it. They're making sure there's no sex in any TV that you see or movies. The church is telling you it's evil, and yet your body is constantly going, I am horny as hell and I want to have sex, or I want to masturbate, or I want to fulfill this drive of some sort, you know, find some sort of solution to this hormonal imbalance that I've got. And so you lived in these kind of guilt and shame cycles, because naturally before long, I discovered porn. And that was my only option as far as engaging with any form of sexuality. I learned everything I know about sex through porn. Could you think of a more damaging way to learn about sex? I mean, I'm sure there are ethical forms of porn that can be a lot more from the female gaze and can be a lot more educational. But generally speaking, this was not what 14-year-old Phil was looking for. And so I just didn't have a healthy relationship, because then what would happen is I would get turned on, I would sneak off somewhere, I'd look at a dirty magazine, or I'd go on the internet and take 4 hours to load one image, you know, like back in the day when, you know, it was dial up and it took 20 minutes and images would like slowly load on your screen, like line by line. But, you know, I was a patient watcher of porn these days. You know, you do that, and then you would have this huge, overwhelming wave of guilt and shame, and oh gosh, you're so terrible, you're evil, you're dirty, God is disappointed with you, God will not be able to forgive you, all these kind of thoughts that eventually you would then go, no, God forgives me, and you know, and you'd kind of figure that out. But often you're in such cycles that you're doing this a couple of times a day sometimes. And so it was a really traumatic experience, actually. And in my work, I work with people that are in the process of leaving different kind of institutional religions and questioning their spirituality. And I deal with thousands of people a year that are going through this, and have been deeply traumatized. My words, traumatized. And really have a lot of sexual hang-ups because of this kind of cycle that was going on. They're told that their sexual urges are evil, and yet they are still at the mercy of trying to figure out their bodies and learn as they're growing up, and they're not given any method of learning healthily. Maybe in school a little bit, they would have got a bit of sexual education, but honestly, at our age, there wasn't that much great sexual education then. I mean, even now, I'm not sure how good sexual education is in schools. I don't know, but I imagine it's lacking.
I don't know either. And I'm not sure about you, Phil, but growing up, I went to a Muslim school growing up, and we definitely had a lack of sexual education, because it was like, you know, it was like a taboo thing like similar to you. Is like the only thing they'll say is that you cannot do it until you're married. It's a sacred bond between a husband and a wife. And yeah, I mean, that's a whole other thing. And it's actually really interesting for me to hear the perspective of a male growing up in a similar situation, because I can imagine there would be similarities to the experience, but also vast differences because of you know, being a male. But yeah, I mean, so what would you have liked to be told about sex growing up? Like, and who would you have liked to have told you that? Like, would you have liked to have that coming from your parents or from your teachers?
It's a hard one. I mean, it's fine in hindsight to look back, right, and go, this is what I should have been told, and this was where I was going to get my sexual hang-ups, and this is where that weird thing was going to develop, or whatever. I don't know. I don't know if my parents were in a place where they could have had that kind of conversation, and so I don't know if I would have wanted to learn from my parents, because I probably would have, like my dad, he probably would have been able to talk to me a bit more about sex, but I did not want to hear more about because there was no normacy in that. So I mentioned at the beginning, Dr. Tina Shermer Sellers. She's a sexologist. She works with people in the area of healthy sexual kind of orientation and understanding. And she says that they've done studies on parents to children's relationships, and the number one correlation to having a healthy relationship with your parents when you are an adult is if they talk to you throughout your childhood about sex. And so I think if my parents had been talking to me about sex throughout my childhood, there would have been this level of vulnerability and openness and transparency that we could have had those kind of conversations. They could have said, hey, Phil, it's really normal that you're having these sexual urges right now. There's different ways that you're going to want to explore that. And some of them are going to be healthy. Some of them are going to be less healthy. We're really happy for you to figure that out. We're here if you want to talk about that, or we can put you in touch with someone. We've got some friends, or maybe there's some slightly older, young adults that you might feel more comfortable talking to, or whoever it might have been at that age. I think having some sort of signposts would have been tremendously helpful. Being able to be told, look, it's really normal that these urges are happening. This happens to everyone, and it doesn't happen to everyone because they're deeply evil and, whatever. It's a natural part of the process, and it's also really important and natural to experiment with that and figure out, what is my sex drive, what is my sexuality, what do I like, what do I not like. These are really important things that when you show up and you do bring it to the table, right, when you do go, oh, I'm married now, or I'm in a committed relationship, or whatever it might be, right, but in that context I was only going to ever imagine this being married as a young kid growing up in a conservative home. So, but when I get married, it's suddenly going to be okay. But I'm going to have to magically know how to do this, what I like, what I don't like, how to communicate. Even learning to communicate about my sexual desires, what I like, what I didn't like, was so hard for me when I first got married. There was so much shame. Right? Anything I did want to do, I was like, oh God, can I even say it? Oh God, what are they going to think about me? Or any really normal stuff as well. And not even to shame anything that's abnormal, right? I mean, do you if it's consensual and enjoyable. But I just think there was so much thrown onto that didn't need to be. That if there had been conversations, and it's not that I needed to hear specific things, I just needed to have a safe space to have that conversation. And so I'm not putting that on my parents, because frankly they just weren't in a place to have that conversation, weren't in a place. They themselves were, in this, conservative Christian bubble that only allowed for certain views of Christianity, of sexuality and sex. So of course they weren't equipped to kind of have these conversations with their kids. But it sure would have been nice to have some people in my life to have that, which I only found much, much later on. Even things like, hey, how your libido is going to be different than other people's. And so talking about the male-female difference that we hear. So in the church, we're frequently told men just are constantly horny. They want to have sex nonstop, and they're just basically penises running around with arms and legs. And they're just going to have sex with anything that moves. Women don't show anything, barely. You would understand this from an Islamic background, right? It's don't show your knees, or people will be unable to control themselves or whatever. But so what happens is women feel a lot of shame and all sorts of stuff about their bodies. They feel they start to reject their bodies. They feel shame about it, all sorts of different stuff. They feel guilt or whatever. And guys are told that I have no control anyway, so this is just who I am, which is not a very healthy thing. But what's interesting about it as well is when it comes to libidos, men are told you are this insatiable animal. So by the time you get married, you're just going to be able to have sex nonstop all the time. It'll be great. And women, you're not particularly very sexually orientated. You just want to talk and to cuddle. And so you're not going to want to have sex, but you're going to have to do it, which, by the way, is rape. We should just address that. But what's fascinating about that is it's not true. It's just not true. That is two massive extremes of libido that largely aren't massively present. Very few people never want to have sex or constantly want to have sex. I don't care how good sex is. I don't want it 24/7, right? Maybe the teenage me did. But generally speaking, that's not true. But what's interesting is in couples, they find that actually 1/3 of couples, give or take, it's about 33% of couples, the females have a higher libido than the males.